what is the difference between the current Ukrainian war and the wars that the Americans have fought in the recent past, like in Afghanistan or Iraq? Many people just think, hey, war is war and it's all bad and it's all a bunch of tanks. But there are some pretty significant differences between the two wars, not just America's role in them, but actually in the nature of the war itself. In the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which were basically the same, there was very little difference between the two. Those were what's called an insurgency war, to where you had a state country, and then you had the U.S. going in to help the actual government. So it was a government on the ground, and then there was rebels or insurgents that were trying to fight to overturn the government and to try to drive out the United States in our particular case, or all the allies that were there to help. So what you didn't have was any kind of formal front lines. You had areas where the enemy was, the Taliban, in our view, in Afghanistan, or the rebel Sunni Muslims in Iraq. And what you had was like certain areas in the country where there were few military forces, and they would basically be driving down the roads. They would be dismounted. They would be on patrol going through the cities. And then they would be talking to people to try to find out where they were. They would go on sometimes these night raids to try and find them. But what you never had was, or at least not very often, is a clash of units, large numbers. Of course, the ubiquitous IED, the roadside bombs that happen, or ambushes that the insurgents would use, because they can't go toe to toe with a formal military. And so that was the nature of the war, and why it was so very hard to actually win, because you didn't even know for sure who the enemy was at any one time. You maybe seen lots of images of vehicles blowing up, or these graphic images of troops who had lost limbs because they were out on patrol and stepped on a mine. Those are the kinds of things that happen, and why it's so hard to fight that. This war in Ukraine is very different, because it's not just a government and then there's insurgents within the government. There are actually two opposing field armies, and the terms for winning are also very different. In the insurgency case, it's like, okay, you have to make the government either tired of fighting, as did happen in Afghanistan, where they finally just collapsed because the insurgent side won and it ended up taking over the government, or that the government side would make the insurgents finally so tired of fighting that without winning that they finally gave up. But that was how you determine when there, and it's a lot murkier. In this case right here in Ukraine, it is a mano on mano. It is a army on an army, and the victor is which army is going to succeed and defeat the other army. And so now then we have much bigger issues, and of course the bloodshed is 10 times worse, 100 times worse, and we have casualties in currently, as of right now, the low number I've heard is 500,000 on both the Russian and Ukrainian side, though some estimates have it substantially higher than that, 700,000-800,000. I think that's probably closer given the amount of firepower that's being used. Whereas in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, you had casualties in a very different scale. In Afghanistan, after 24 years, you had, I want to say it was 2,000 some odd killed in action for Americans, and about 20,000 that were wounded in action. That's in 20 years of fighting. And in Iraq, the numbers were about 4,000 Americans killed and 35,000 wounded. So the scale and the scope and the objectives are all very different.